Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Dmitry Grozoubinski. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here today for the Geneva book launch. It's not a true book launch because the book is available already, but the Geneva iteration of the book launch for Trade Links, New Rules for a New World. I feel like I'm on a shopping channel. By our eminent guest from overseas, Professor James Bacchus, who absolutely needs no introduction in this town. My curse in this role is that I am constantly introducing people when I am the only one on stage no one knows. But Professor Bacchus is a distinguished professor at the University of Central Florida. Before that, he was a US congressman, and before that, he founded a little organization called the World Trade Organization and served as a chairman of the appellate body twice. A modest CV that is easy to follow for the rest of us. And with him is another person who absolutely needs no introduction, Professor Gabrielle Marceau. She is a counselor at the WTO's Research Division, no longer the Legal Affairs Division, but the Research Division. And she is also a professor at UNIGE here in Geneva. So we are very glad to have both of you here, and we hope you enjoy your time in Geneva. You and your wife, thank you for making the trip out and sharing your ideas. Before I move on to the meat of our, let me thank our amazing team that put this together, Juanita and the team from the Graduate Institute and the GTP that put all of this together, Toby from Managi Sound, who makes sure that you can all hear us, and of course the hotel president for putting us on. I believe this is the 5th book you have written, at least so my internet research suggests. And I think it's an incredibly timely one. I hope you all have a chance to check it out. A few weeks ago, we had a discussion, in fact, in this very room, about the future of US trade policy that focused a lot on IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, this new model of US engagement with that part of the world. And a certain troublemaker in the crowd, Professor Marceau, asked the question that was on a lot of people's minds, which is, this sounds very interesting, are there any rules in it? I'm paraphrasing slightly, but I think that sort of encapsulates the fact that there is this demand for where are rules going? Where are the rules that we have now? And what are the rules that the world is crying out for and how they will be shaped? In a moment, I'll invite Professor Bacchus up here to give you what this book is about. But perhaps by way of beginning, let me embarrass him by praising the book by talking about some of the things that it is not. And specifically, what impressed the hell out of me with this book is that it is not narrow. It is not narrow in lens. It is in many ways a meditation on where we are as an international order, both economic, but I think much more broader than that. It really embraces the trade and concept that I know many of you work on and are interested in, that we at the GTP hold close. It begins by really diagnosing how we got to where we are today and the forces that will drive where we're going tomorrow. It is not it's not a trade wonks book. It's also not narrow in audience. I am not a trade lawyer, but I have the fortune of knowing many trade lawyers, and anyone who has ever spent time with trade lawyers in the social setting knows that at some point they descend into conversations that exclusively consist of DS numbers. So they will say incomprehensible things like, are you following DS 511? It makes shrimp turtle look like New Zealand apples. And it's just sitting there frantically Googling to try to keep up. This book is for a genuinely broad audience. It is not narrow in audience. You could hand this to someone who has never followed a DS dispute, and I think they would get a lot out of it. It's also not narrowly political, and I mean that as the highest form of praise. It's certainly a book that is not ignorant of the politics. It does not shy away from the fact that many of the issues it discusses are intensely political, but it is not a narrow political screed. It is not the platform of the Democratic Party now or future. It is apolitical without being politically ignorant. And finally, and this is something you rarely get to say about a trade text in 2022, it is not narrow of hope. It believes that there is progress possible. It doesn't shy away from the scale of the challenges across any of the areas that it talks about, whether it's trade links to the environment, sustainability, inclusiveness, but it believes that something is possible, and something is possible at the World Trade Organization. And from a Geneva perspective, that is eminently pleasant to read. And so with perhaps that negative introduction of what this book isn't, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome to the podium Professor Bacchus to talk to us a little bit about what this book is. Professor Bacchus. Thank
you so much. Thank you, Dmitry. Perhaps I should stop now and send you all off to your laptops to order the book. I will say that I will autograph copies later if you'd like them to be worth more on eBay after you read them. Seriously, I want to thank Dmitry and the Geneva Trade Platform and the Graduate Institute for their hospitality, their generosity in organizing and hosting this event. And I'd like to thank my friend Gabrielle for being here. Gabrielle is truly one of the most distinguished international civil servants in Geneva and a huge asset for the WTO. She always has been. I say this for two reasons. First of all, it's true. Second, I'm hoping she'll pull her punches a little bit later on, although I'm not counting on that. It's good, too, to see old friends from a number of countries here with us, and I understand there are quite a few more who will be listening later to this recorded event. Thank you all so much. And what you described is exactly what I intended with the book, Dmitry, so I'm pleased that I seem to have accomplished that task. I certainly hope everyone will read the book, but I'm really more interested in the message than I am in peddling the book. I think it's the message that matters, and I'm devoted to the delivery of that message worldwide. In my case, it's a message not only about trade, but also about climate change and sustainable development. I have been involved in working for sustainable development longer than I've been involved in working for freer trade. And I've been involved in working for freer trade for quite a long while. When I was elected to the Congress in 1990, I was immediately enlisted by the senior members of the Congress in working on something called the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations. As it happened, I was the first former trade negotiator for the United States, later to be elected to Congress. So I had actually read the GATT. And thus I was involved in the last several years of the Uruguay round. Ultimately, I became one of the 6 original co-sponsors of the implementing legislation that the United States Congress passed to agree to the Uruguay round trade agreements and establish the WTO. And then, of course, a few months later, I was nominated by my country to be one of the first 7 jurists on the newly formed appellate body of the WTO, and I served there during the first decade of the WTO, and by election of my colleagues, I served twice as the chair. So I suppose I am one of the founders of the WTO, but I hasten to add, there were thousands of us worldwide, and it was the product of every country engaged in the negotiations over the course of nearly a decade. It was a global decision to establish an international trade institution that would oversee trade worldwide in accordance with globally agreed rules, and also through the mechanism of a binding system of dispute settlement enforcement when the inevitable disputes over the meanings of those rules came along. I worry now that too often the world overlooks the accomplishments of the WTO. Many of you are engaged in those accomplishments on a daily basis, so I'll simply say what's often overlooked and what a journalist in the audience would tell me is not news, and that is that, first of all, almost all of the trade among 164 member countries of the WTO every day of the year is conducted almost entirely without legal dispute and in accordance with the rules in the WTO treaty. Because of this, the volume of world trade is significantly higher than it would otherwise be, and the potential for the gains from trade worldwide is likewise higher than it would otherwise be. There's more opportunity for more global prosperity everywhere. There's no guarantee of it, but there's more opportunity for it. Secondly, for all the troubles we're experiencing now with our dispute settlement system, it has to be said that the WTO dispute settlement system remains highly effective in most respects and is still the most effective international dispute settlement system of any kind in the history of the world to this day and on this day. Yet, having said these things of which we're all proud, I think it has to be asked where we are now in terms of our efforts to advance the purposes of the WTO treaty of all the founders now 27 years ago. What have we truly accomplished of what we had hoped we would accomplish in 1995? And here, because I care so much about the survival and success of the system and its centrality to the international economy, and I would say its centrality to much that we indeed hope to do together beyond conventional categories of economics, that we have to be candid. We have to be candid with ourselves and with each other about where we stand. Apart from a few agreements, the Information Technology Agreement early on that's since been expanded and improved, the Government Procurement Agreement among some but not all WTO members, the Trade Facilitation Agreement concluded in Bali in 2013, the progress on agricultural export subsidies and some other agricultural issues in Nairobi a couple of years later. Apart from that, in terms of a complication, the complications that have arisen, and because of them, we have accomplished absolutely nothing in negotiating new or revised rules under the WTO treaty. And a lot has happened in 27 years. We failed with the Doha Development Round, and thus we continue to have the inherited trade agenda, where a grand bargain still exists if we want to claim it, if we can find the political will to claim it. On the one hand, developing countries could and should be given their comparative advantage in agriculture through vast changes in trade-distorting agricultural subsidies in the developing world, and also through changes in the trade remedies laws, which are often applied by the developing countries perniciously against developing countries. In exchange, I think developing countries would be more receptive to proposals for reducing the remaining tariffs on manufactured goods and also for eliminating the array of barriers to trade and services where the developed countries have more of a comparative advantage, at least for the time being. But we are nowhere on achieving any of that. Also, there are what I speak of in the book as the new commercial issues of the 21st century. These are issues on which we may or may not have rules. Where we have rules, they're not many. and they need to be improved. There are a lot of new things that have happened in the global economy since 1995. Most prominent, I would say, is digital trade. How is ours truly a world trading system at this point when the WTO has no rules on digital trade? Another is intellectual property, where, as I point out in the book, much has happened in terms of the conclusion of new intellectual property agreements since the conclusion of the TRIPS agreement in 1995. And why are we not addressing those agreements through incorporation by reference into the treaty? And why have we not been clearer about the basic balance in the treaty that exists, and I would say does not have to be negotiated, it already exists in the treaty, between intellectual property rights and access to intellectual property? There's also competition law, what we Americans called antitrust law. We have the trade remedies rules, which are in a form of behind-the-border competition policy. But much more needs to be done to establish fair rules to fight cartels and fight other types of oligopolies throughout the world that are now increasingly operating internationally. We're not even negotiating about that. We have some headway through some basic rules on trade-related investment measures, but why have we not done more to promote trade investment facilitation in the way that we have trade facilitation? Why isn't that higher on our agenda? And these are only the trade issues, as opposed to what Dmitry rightly described as the trade and issues. It's the trade and issues, the trade links, that my book is most about. If you read the very first page and the very first paragraph in the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement that established the WTO, you will see that the members of the WTO at the beginning agreed that their intent was to pursue trade and economic endeavor in a way that was in accordance with the principles and objectives of sustainable development. Here I'm paraphrasing the treaty. This was not an accident. All of this occurred at about the same time as the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. Many of these negotiators were involved in both of those landmark efforts. Some say that in stressing the need to do more to make the WTO as an institution transform trade rules so that they are not only not obstacles to sustainable development, but instead affirmative agents for sustainable development, that I am departing from the intention of the WTO. Not so, not at all. What I'm simply doing is expressing anew the original intent of the WTO. And I stress that in this book, where it's become apparent in the world today is that we no longer have the luxury of just engaging in a ritual reminder that we're supposed to be supporting sustainable development with WTO rules. We need to go about doing it urgently and in a very serious way on many different fronts. Also, we need to understand that sustainable development is not solely about the environment. Those of us who've been involved in the fight for the SDGs, as they're called, and are working now to implement them worldwide, as I am with many others, will always say up front that it's important to understand that there are social and economic as well as environmental goals in the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, the Agenda for 2030. The first goal is to eliminate poverty. Well, I don't see how you can do that unless you lower barriers to trade. The second goal is to eliminate hunger. I would say the same thing, and so on. Issues that involve inclusiveness, gender equity, for example. Well, that's one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm pleased we're working on that to some extent in the WTO. But I think these issues should be at the center of what we're doing now. There are obstacles to that, and we know what they are. My own country, half a dozen years ago, lost its way on trade, and I fear we have not yet found our way back. I hope we will. And that has been a problem for the trading system and for the world. The global financial crisis helped kill the Doha Development Round. I think it was in trouble even before that, but I think that was the death knell, ultimately, for the round, as it encouraged more and more countries to turn inward and away from trade and other forms of multilateralism. Then, of course, we became increasingly aware of the degradations and the very real imminence and reality of climate change, which is inseparable from trade as an issue. And then, of course, there are all the other issues relating to our biosystem, biodiversity loss, and so much more that need addressing equally to climate change. Then there was something called the COVID pandemic. And much of our progress on so many of these fronts unraveled in poverty, for example. And we're still confronting the COVID pandemic. And now we have an additional challenge posed by the inexcusable invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine, with all of the economic and other fallout from that. And one might say, this is all too much, that at this point, we'll be lucky if we can hold anything together at all as a trading system. What I say is that we need to seize this as an opportunity for bringing the trading system fully into the 21st century and for transforming our rules into rules that are fit for purpose for all of the trade links that cannot be separated from trade. Foremost, I would say, is climate change. And in the book, I have an elaborate proposal for a WTO climate waiver. There's absolutely no political support for this now at all, anywhere. But my prediction is that several years from now, the members will turn to this as a necessary means of ending what could well, unfortunately, become a climate war involving trade restrictive climate measures. We need also, I would suggest, to deal with some of the other related issues such as biodiversity, sustainable agriculture, deforestation. And in many of these issues, I go on at great lengths in the book explaining precisely how I think rules can be written and can be revised to be responsive to these needs. For example, I would condition trade on sustainable practices in agriculture relating to forests, relating to much more. But what I stress that's often not mentioned in the press in the West is that these kinds of measures will pose a price for developing countries that they should not be asked to pay. And we should not expect them to agree to these changes unless we somehow find the way to begin providing them with the financial and other resources they need to meet their obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement, and also to be able to promote more sustainable practices in their own production facilities and procedures back home. So this would involve, I would say, a lot of money, much technology transfer and much transfer of human and physical capital, the means to build the infrastructure that's needed to be sustainable, the training to have the people who can help promote sustainable practices. And I don't think any of these trade restrictions should be allowed unless these countries that may be affected by them adversely have the means to comply with them. And that means must come in the form of an allowance under the rules and support from other international financial institutions. The two issues that are uppermost in my mind now and that I think need to be uppermost for members of the WTO are, of course, health and food. And on the issue of trade and health, how can we explain that more than 2 years into the pandemic, we have not yet concluded any kind of an agreement that would free up trade in pharmaceuticals and other health products? Instead, we have tariffs, we have export restrictions, we have all kinds of hindrances to trade in drugs and other medical goods. Why do we have an average of a 17% tariff on soap? Why should there be a tariff on soap? And that's just one of many examples. And adding to the challenges we face in health now are those that we increasingly face in food, where we see every day some new country somewhere imposing export restrictions. Now, we should know from our experience in the financial crisis with the food supply issues at that time that this won't work. It's politically appealing domestically everywhere, but it only leads to further restrictions elsewhere that altogether make supplies more unstable and give rise to even further price increases. Members of the WTO need to be doing something about that other than talking about it. I'm going to stop in a minute, but I want to address an issue that I alluded to earlier, and that is our Ministerial Conference. It's coming up in just a few days. We cannot say with any certainty that anything will be accomplished there. Now, I've been in Geneva off and on for many years, and I understand these negotiations. I've participated in them. I know there's a temptation to say that, well, if we've agreed that next month we're going to meet and discuss whether we're going to take a piece of paper and write a list of things that we hope one day can be the topic of a task force, that then we'll meet and we'll try to refine them further so that maybe we can put together a working paper so that perhaps we can propose this will be on the WTO agenda sometime in the future. That's a success. That's not the way the rest of the world works. That's not the way they look at the trading system. They want things to be done. And here I don't blame the delegates, I blame the political capitals, because people here only do what they're allowed to do back home. So what will we accomplish here? We've been negotiating on fishery subsidies for 20 years. It's time to end those negotiations successfully. We've been negotiating off and on about environmental goods and making them duty-free for 20 years. I'm not sure anyone here thinks we're going to conclude that agreement successfully at this ministerial conference. How can we even speak about technology transfer to developing countries if we can't even eliminate duties on environmental goods? I'm hopeful that something will come of these efforts by 100-odd countries on digital trade. So far, my understanding is that the only thing they've agreed on finally is that none of them like spam. And I think that's an important conclusion, but at a time when world trade is increasingly conducted digitally, we need to have better understandings about how that will be done. We need better rules of the road so that we can smooth that type of trade and increase global prosperity. I wish them well. The list is short of things that we really hope to conclude, and yet there's so much more that we need to do. What I would encourage the members of the WTO to do is take the advice of some countries that have been trying to put some of these trade and sustainable development issues on the agenda, because they are out there. And I would propose that we look at the issues they're talking about in terms of eco-labeling and a lot more, and begin to try to make real progress on those issues. I would also suggest that the members of the WTO make a statement on climate change. I don't expect the membership to pursue my proposal for a WTO climate waiver now, but the truth of the matter is that the WTO needs to make it much more doable for countries around the world, the members of the WTO, to engage in carbon pricing and to take real action at the national level to address carbon emissions. A simple idea, and one that does not require any change of any rules, is simply to adopt a legal interpretation saying that the carbon tax is an indirect tax on a product and therefore eligible for a border tax adjustment. Very simple. Why not do that? Something else we should do here is make a statement to the world about fossil fuels. I'm among those who believes we need to decarbonize the world, but I also think it's going to be a very hard thing to do, even when we truly set out to do it. What is the worst thing that we can do? Subsidize fossil fuels. That is absolutely perverse. We should be taking action right now to turn fossil fuel subsidies into prohibited subsidies under the subsidies rules. I want to stop here for now because I want to give Ms. Marceau a chance to grill me, and I do want to give as many of you as possible a chance to pose questions to me, which I'll be happy to try my best to answer. There are about 300 pages in the book that I haven't discussed, so if there may be something in the book to answer one or two of your questions. I'm very proud to have had a chance to help develop the WTO as an institution, and I'm proud of so much that's been accomplished by the WTO. But I'm one person, I'm one American also, who wants the multilateral trading system to survive and continue to succeed and continue to be central to the world economy. But I think it's only if action is taken now that that can happen. So I encourage all of you to do everything you can to act. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Professor. I accused the book of not being narrow, and you proceeded to give a description of its ideas that began somewhere around digital trade, ended at fossil fuels, and past spam, fisheries, health and food on the way. So I hope that gives you a sense of just how much you're getting in terms of value in the text. Someone who I know has read the text and has some thoughts on it is our discussant today, Professor Marceau. I will leave the floor open to you for your first reflections, your thoughts on this text, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you very much, Dmitry, and thank you, Jim, for including me in this discussion debate. I think I'll be brief because we have 10 minutes left, and I would really think we should involve people there. And I'll say a few things and then throw a few questions. The trade ban is an old issue. Many of you here are young. When I started in '88, the Americans were leading this first debate with the first tuna, trade and environment, trade and labor, and now everything is trade and. But, and this is where this book brings value, it's more than trade and that everything is all about. And you see recently in this war involving Russia and Ukraine, for instance, when the US president wanted to irritate Russia, he made a threat of kicking Russia out of the WTO. Not out of ITU, no more internet, or out of WHO, no more vaccine. So it shows the importance of trade, and this is the number one message of this book, which is an hallelujah, which is obvious, but an hallelujah that it forced people to think about it when Jim writes, trade links everything. And it's not only import-export of shoes and cars, and this we saw in COVID, when early on, Kazakhstan, for instance, worried and blocked food. And then countries realized that unless you produce vaccine, well, you need to import and export them. So the fact that you have many items that cross the border, 30 countries of origin for a pair of jeans was what we used to say many years ago. Now it's even more for vaccine. Put a lot of emphasis on the importance of trade and the importance of the WTO. But the wealth of this book is that it does what you both said, link trade with many, many more items. And I have no problem. I will say one word before I go into my questions about digital trade. Again, focusing on the importance of the WTO, maybe it's because there's nothing else. But recently, those of you who follow digital trade, you must be aware that EU and US, for instance, notified some of their artificial intelligence regulation and norms or Internet of Things to TBT, saying that it can be seen as a product characteristic because these unmaterial things, artificial intelligence, will affect goods. So you see, governments want a forum of governance. So they want the WTO, but as Jim made it clear, it's limited, it's difficult to integrate new rules and be up to date. And here I go to my questions to you. Difficult. It's not a challenge on the book. I'd like you to push forward your ideas, and because you have so much experience also in the US political system, which is also difficult. So there are many governments who are willing to deal with new issues, and this we see in individual actions, but also some GSI. You talk about a climate waiver, and conceptually it's ideal. So my sort of 2 or 3 questions to start with to you is, at the moment we do have Article 20 of the GATT that allows for unilateral action, and I'm not allowed to say that, but you were judge on the 2 shrimp disputes, where it was repeated twice that Article 20 is or can be used for unilaterally determined policies. That's quite a U-turn from the GATT approach. So why do we need a climate waiver if today, maybe as a second and third best, governments can immediately go ahead? Other question, should we set aside consensus?
You're assuming I'll remember the first question?
Well, I have only 3. I have only 3. And it's all about consensus and how, and the balance between consensus and unilateral actions that are not top, second best or third best, but at least they keep the machine running. And my last question also link You all know that there's a few GSI, including 3 on environmental related issues, 1 on e-commerce. And it is amazing to participate in the discussions in GSI room. It reminds me the energy 30 years ago when governments were selecting the appellate body members and the enthusiasm. Is it good? Is it viable, these GSI? And finally, and this is a bit besides, but I think it's important because I was touched. You condemned export restrictions in times of COVID, and you suggest that, for instance, border tax adjustment could be simply declared as acceptable for tax on carbon. But a group of students asked me from this institution months back, how can you blame India, who signed contracts, as you know, to make medicines, vaccine, and then stopped exporting to give it to its people? How can you reconcile democracy in India, their conception of democracy, with the needs of other countries? Again, this is not directly in your book, but it's all about multilateralism, the new form of multilateralism, consensus. I believe multilateralism is maybe wide like this, consensus is narrower. So there are all sorts of ways to express multilateralism. So these are some of my questions for the little time. I hope you respond, and I'll take pleasure in continuing questions.
Gabrielle, I'll do my best. If I happen to forget one of them, you're free to remind me. And let me say also to everyone here, as I understand it, we have the room for a while, and also they can keep recording. I'm happy to stay for as long as you wish to try to answer any questions you may have. I wouldn't want anyone to have come here for this with a question that did not have a chance to answer it. I can promise you a response. I can't promise you an answer, but I'll do my best. You've asked a number of questions that are worthy of articles and books themselves. Some of them I've addressed to some extent in the book, others I have not. Let me start with your first question. Why not just rely on Article 20? And the problem with Article 20 is this. While I think you and I and Werner and Christoph and Carolyn and a few other people here today could get together and craft a national measure that restricted trade for climate reasons in such a way that it would thread the needle of Article 20, we won't be the ones crafting such measures. They will be crafted, and I say this as someone who has been one, by politicians throughout the world. And these politicians will be responding not only to climate concerns, but to perceived economic concerns, to concerns about carbon leakage. For example, we can debate the extent to which there has been and is carbon leakage in terms of economic impact. There's certainly carbon leakage in terms of climate impact. But the answer economically doesn't really matter because everyone everywhere believes there's carbon leakage economically and that they're losing competitiveness. So when one is trying to craft a national measure with a climate motivation, I think almost inevitably that measure is not going to be legally pure in an Article 20 sense. It's going to be a measure that may have climate motivations, but will also be mixed with economic motivations. The problem in Article 20 is that where there are economic motivations for a measure in addition to environmental reasons, then it's very hard to have the benefit of the general exception in the agreement. And this is why I come to a climate waiver. I mentioned that we could easily resolve the issue of a carbon tax because I think as I read GATT Article 2, and forgive me for being a jurist here, that even without such an interpretation, that's the answer that most WTO jurists would reach. However, in the absence of that answer from the system, where all we've got is some working party from 1971, there's uncertainty. It has a chilling effect, I would suggest, on adopting carbon taxes in many places of the world. It at least provides an excuse for not taking the politically ambitious road of trying to pass such taxes. But carbon taxes are not the only form of trade restrictions for climate reasons. There are all kinds of other different border carbon adjustment mechanisms, bans, limitations, regulations, standards, all kinds of things that can likewise be taken for both climate and economic reasons. So what I have proposed in the book is that the members negotiate a waiver, that they identify certain defined kinds of measures that may have both climate and economic motivations that will be acceptable as defenses against a certain defined list of rules in the waiver, that perhaps we add other innovations as well. Climate clubs would be something that I would allow. You can even build toward a sustainable energy trade agreement with such an effort. Well, what kind of measures would we be talking about? We would be talking about those measures that discriminate on the basis of the carbon content of a product and are legitimate climate response measures, and also that meet the requirements of the chapeau, that they not be applied in an arbitrary or unjustifiable manner or as a disguised restriction on trade. There are problems there. As I point out in the book, we don't have an agreed method globally of calculating the amount of carbon emitted in a product. I think the COP needs to agree on that. The COP's been trying for 20 years to agree, has not yet done so. Also, the COP has failed to create a definition of a climate response measure. They haven't done that either. I would much rather have the climate institution answer these questions and then have WTO judges rely on those definitions on a case-by-case basis. So that's why I think we need the waiver, because of these mixed motivations. Your other questions, remind me of the last one because it was especially good.
JSI, the value and consensus.
Well, I am very pleased that a goodly number of the members of the WTO seem at last to be taking these kinds of issues seriously, and they're trying to begin to grapple with them here in Geneva. And that I see as extraordinary given where we were 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. I think it's an extraordinarily important undertaking. In terms of, if I understood one of your other questions, I think you were asking me about the virtues of taking plurilateral approaches. And with many of these issues, I think plurilateral approaches are the best. If one looks back to the early days of trying to create the WTO, what do you see? You see a whole slew of plurilateral agreements that were transformed into multilateral agreements, the GATT codes, anti-dumping standards, others. And I think we should be doing that now. Now, here I perfectly understand the view of some developing countries in not wanting to allow the negotiation of non-MFN agreements plurilaterally within the WTO. I understand them when they say that we should be doing things multilaterally. They're absolutely right about that. However, while that's the ideal, let's not make the ideal an enemy of what can be accomplished. And I think they're being short-sighted in doing this because what they're doing is basically pushing the countries that want to move forward on some of these issues outside the legal framework of the WTO to where the developing countries don't really have any say in negotiating these rules, and yet inevitably, in effect, they'll be impacted by them. I think we need to open the floor to questions.
Absolutely.
Now, don't we, Dmitry? Thank
have,
you, Gabrielle.
If you'll all bear with us, I would suggest we spend about 15 minutes with questions in formal mode. But of course, Professor Bacchus has made himself available afterwards if you want to ask follow-up questions and pick holes in his reasoning. You can do so at your leisure. So with that, let me open the floor to questions. When you ask your question, please feel free to introduce yourself, and please do speak into the microphones that our colleague Rong will bring to you. Is anyone feeling brave?
Don't hesitate. People have been picking holes in my opinions for a long time.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Jean-Marie Pogam. I'm DDG from the WTO. It's always inspiring to hear you. I think my question
It's good to see you, my friend. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for the speak. My question is some sort of follow-up of Gabrielle's point on the plurilateral and environment. And basically, it's about the political economy of the WTO. As you know, as a former trade negotiator, we are dominated by this mercantilist model that you have a give and take. So I need to go back with to my capital with some concession from the other to sell the agreement. And if I go plurilateral, it's the same thing. My obsession is the free rider. So I'm going to look for the critical mass and all that. But when it comes to discussing about the environment, which is not about exchanging value, but producing a public good, can this pattern of negotiation work? Which is a very different pattern of negotiation than the one we have in the environmental negotiation, where you set the objective, for instance, in the Paris Agreement, and you have national determined contribution. So is it possible to turn the WTO into a machinery where small coalitions, maybe unilateral actions contributing to the public good would be the basis for trade agreement? I think it's very...
I think you're absolutely right in terms of creating public goods. For a developing country to have a higher environmental standard is ultimately going to be productive of higher economic production as well. The problem, understandably, is getting from here to there. Here, I think there may be something of a model in the Trade Facilitation Agreement where different countries were allowed to take on different levels of obligations over time, and where taking on those obligations was conditioned on getting the financial help and the technical assistance to enable them to comply with those obligations. As I stressed earlier, there's been much emphasis in the European Union, obviously, but also in Canada, the United States, and some other developed countries about the need to begin to impose trade restrictions for climate reasons. But who will bear the burden of these restrictions? It's largely developing countries. And it's simply not right to expect them to bear the burden of these restrictions if they don't have the means and the opportunity to begin to produce in such a way that will comply with them. And this is only the trade part of the larger climate problem, where there simply must be a lot more money provided to developing countries to be able to meet their current climate pledges and be able to take on additional pledges. It's just not fair to impose these obligations on them without providing them with this wherewithal. And for the most part, some of the smaller developing countries, especially in the coastal and island states, they've done the least to cause climate change, and now they're bearing the brunt of it for geographical reasons. So we certainly should be not simply imposing these requirements on them. We should be working with them to try to figure out a way in which all of us could create these public goods, as you quite rightly call them.
Professor Marceau, I think you wanted to jump in as well. And then we'll go to this gentleman in the front row if your question's still...
I was just going to support your question, Jean-Marie, with elements of answers. My understanding of MEAs, I think the trade facilitation borrowed from, is a different logic where you help countries before they cannot reach their commitments, etc. So there is financial support throughout the process. But my point, 2 points I'd like to raise about those new GSI and plurilateral is that there is absolutely no obligation under the WTO to have a decision, multilateral decision, to start negotiations. The WTO is a permanent forum of negotiations contrary to the GATT. The issue of whether everybody agrees is an issue that comes at the end. And as Professor Bacchus said, it's been like this for years, all negotiations start with a subgroup. And I think it's healthy. The last comment about, if we look at the e-commerce GSI, I believe governments have even the obligation to try to regulate e-commerce, cybersecurity, the obligation to protect their people. And this obligation, they are states, we forget this, above international organization. Their obligation to take care of their people and e-commerce is above the procedural consensus rule, if there was one, to start negotiations. So I think that the GSI is a good sort of mechanism to deal with all the trade and all these new things and slowly integrate these new topics for an eventual multilateral. And again, to me, multilateralism, and RDG talks about the new multilateralism, is to be understood as something different from consensus, in my personal opinion, of course.
Was that last part thrown in for your boss?
Oh, yeah.
I believe we had a question from this gentleman here.
Hi, this is Marceau from ITC. I work there as an associate officer.
It's an extraordinarily fine organization.
Yes, I'm very happy there. My question is actually, you also pointed out there's a difference between the motivation and understanding of the role of WTO between the people based in Geneva and the people based in capitals. And mostly because people do not understand the role and importance of WTO. Many people know about UN, but not about WTO or how it impacts your life. So there's this difference. And the motivation is because, how do we fill this gap? That is the question. And if they get interested, or perhaps we should just wait for a while when the topics start to actually crystallize in plurilateral agreements on the issue of climate change, on the issue of cybersecurity, and then it will eventually come up. Should we just sit and wait, or sometimes it's frustrating?
It depends on our roles. An ambassador to the WTO cannot go out ahead of her remit from the ministry back home. That's just a fact. That's as it should be. But there are any number of ways where back home we can begin to change our politics. In the United States, I give another speech. It's one that I don't need to give to you. It's about the benefits of trade and the benefits of having rules for trade and the benefits of having a system that oversees the fair action of those rules. There are very few people in the United States giving that speech, and it's much needed. It's also needed in other countries. So the more we can get that message out, I think the better chance we'll have of summoning the political will domestically to do what needs to be done internationally. This is true not just with trade, but all the trade links that I talk about in the book. And in the book, if you find the time to read it, you'll see that I do make that case up front. because it's simply not taken as a given that lowering barriers to trade is something that's desirable. The current United States Trade Representative, when she was being considered for that position in hearings before the Senate Finance Committee in the United States Congress, when she was asked if she believed that lowering barriers to trade was a good thing, did not say yes. She said, well, maybe, sometimes, in some cases. Well, that's a change in our country. And it's a change I do not welcome and one that I oppose. I'm someone who is, I hope, exactly as Dmitry described me, someone who, while understanding politics, tries nevertheless to advocate the right policy, irrespective of any partisan considerations. It will not surprise you to know that I did not vote for President Trump either time he ran. I voted for President Biden. At the same time, I just published a lengthy criticism of the first year of the Biden trade policy. It's almost an extra chapter of this book. It's available online at Cato. The subtitle is The Reign of Polite Protectionism. I think with the Biden administration, we're getting Trumpism without the name calling and without the tweets and without the bullying. But the trade policies are pretty much the same. And that's not what's needed for the United States. It's not what's needed for the WTO. I think I'm free to criticize my own country. I'll refrain from criticizing others. But each of us has our own tale to tell. And most members of the WTO are not doing all that they could be doing to support the multilateral trading system or move forward with further trade liberalization. And that will dictate the outcome of the Ministerial Conference.
Can I go back to one question I had for you, Jim?
Yes, I think I forgot one. It was a good question, but will you remind me of it?
It's about and it goes back to protectionism in your country as well. This comment by the Indian students that export restrictions are expression of democracy, while others would say protectionism. And, you know, it's not a simple question. So the American, whether it's USTR, Thai, or others, the industry, as you call it, they also have views, and they are expression of democracies in your country and other countries. How to reconcile that in the context of consensus?
Well, if I recall my history correctly, in 414 BC, the Athenian Democratic Assembly voted overwhelmingly to send hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of troops to Sicily on an expedition to conquer the Sicilians. That was a democratic expression. It ended in disaster and led to the loss of the Peloponnesian War by Athens. So the question is, how are we going to express our policies democratically? We need the right kind of leadership, and we need the right kind of thinking among followers. And it's a question, I think, of how one defines one's self-interest. You can take the narrow, short-term view and maybe engage in vaccine nationalism, for example. Or you can take the broader and longer view that most medical experts advocate, which is let's make certain we vaccinate everyone everywhere and start with those who are most at risk, because otherwise it will come back, which is happening now as we speak. So I'm not in favor of all expressions of democracy. I'm in favor of expressing things democratically at all times. In fact, my next book is going to be about democratic participation in constructing global governance. I want to explore whether democratic global governance is even possible or whether it must remain an oxymoron.
I look forward to reading this book. That's my question.
We must look to the content of democratic expression, and decisions such as those that are restrictive of trade are ultimately destructive domestically as well as internationally.
And long-term and short-term, I think this is
In both the short-term and the long-term,
the
yes.
wonderful answer. Yeah.
We don't get enough mentions of the Peloponnesian War here in Geneva. It's,
Well, this is a Tony audience, Dmitry. I'm sure that they read Thucydides on the weekends.
well, before the Greek city-states mob the stage, we have time for maybe one more formal question if our professors will agree to give concise answers before we move into informal mode. Does anyone have a final question? Please, Caroline.
Great. Thank you so much, Dmitry. I was intrigued by the conversation that you've both started on what's the sort of the nature of multilateralism. And I think here in Geneva, we all have a tendency to talk about the importance of multilateralism. And Gabrielle, you have underlined that it's about more than consensus. But I feel that we all need to have a better explanation about what it is that we think we're striving for. What gives you multilateralism, especially in the context of plurilaterals? You know, and so what is it really that is this spirit of multilateralism? And I think it's even, obviously it's particularly important now at the time when we're seeing international laws like the Geneva Convention, you know, products of multilateralism that turn out not to be as sacrosanct as one might have wanted. Something that I often think about is that every day here in Geneva, we're trying to make multilateralism work. So it's the practice of countries getting together is already an outcome in itself. It's an extraordinary thing when you see the different interests around the table, that they're even trying to grapple with some of the interests. Now, of course, that's far from the kind of outcomes that Jim has rightly said we need from the system. But I'm just wondering how each of you think about what can we say about what does this multilateralism look like?
Shall I go first? Because I agree with you. Do you want to go first?
No, but Dmitry, the gentleman on the left had a question. So what about listening to his question?
Sure, we can take both and then you can...
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Adrian. I'm an economics student, school teacher, and concerned citizen. Just
Welcome.
a question, quite naive, but you said in the first treaty this sustainable development was already mentioned. How is it that it could evaluate, that government don't support and promote this sustainable development is one thing. But this institution now is representing in the public opinion the opposite of this sustainable development for some part of this public opinion regarding some decisions when a country wants to protect health or environment. That was one question. And my second question is, you said you want this system to continue. I'm asking myself if this nation-state system to address these public good questions we're facing is really the best. You said we need rules. Or the commercial self-interest of these countries, the best sources to put the rules we need now to tackle these issues. Sorry.
Well, let me take that question about how the WTO has acted, because I don't think Gabrielle's really able, since she's with the WTO, to be candid in that answer. I would find a very short list of instances in which I think the WTO has acted unsustainably, either in the actions or decisions of the members or in dispute settlement. I think that is vastly overblown. But what I'm saying is that I don't think the members of the WTO have done what they said they were going to do, what we intended to do when we created the WTO back in 1995, was put the cause of advancing the objectives of sustainable development at the center of the WTO's work. In my mind, as I explain in the book, it's not enough to make certain that WTO rules are not obstacles to pursuing sustainable development. We need to have rules and interpret them in ways that advance the social, economic, and environmental goals of sustainable development. That's what I advocate, and in the book, as you'll see if you get a chance to read it, I have dozens and dozens of specific proposals there. As to the other question, before I turn it over to Gabrielle, she said something very important earlier about what was intended for the WTO as an institution. The WTO was intended to be a framework for negotiations that would occur all the time. As issues arose, there would be new negotiations. They would begin inevitably as negotiations among some, but not all WTO members, as negotiations among those that are interested, such as the dozen or so working on fossil fuel reform now, and several other groups we have mentioned, large and small. That was the intention. I had believed that the Uruguay round would be the last full-blown global all-or-nothing kind of multilateral negotiation. That turned not to be the case. After 9/11, the knee jerked into going right into the old approach. But here, our last point, it's important to understand that that particular approach is only one of a number that are contemplated by the treaty, and they're fully permissible within the multilateral framework, which is the treaty. The treaty anticipates that there will be plurilateral agreements. The only question is, will they be MFN or will they be non-MFN? And that's the only question, but it's very much within the intent of the treaty to proceed plurilaterally, and then in many instances try to build from a plurilateral to a multilateral ultimate solution. Gabrielle?
I have nothing to add. That's perfect answer. But I think that, and it's new, and I think Caroline asked the right question. I think we have to think about WTO is about multilateralism that is good economically. What does it mean? And I really see the WTO as a home for regional trade agreements, for other smaller things, the ITA, which is again a subgroup, etc., etc. And I can make one other parallel. For those who are lawyers, the Article 31.3c of the Vienna Convention says that when you read a treaty, you look at other relevant applicable law. And I think that in the Boeing Airbus report, the appellate body pointed to the right direction, again, as they've done many times, in saying that essentially a treaty of maybe 10 or 16 countries could become extremely relevant if it's a treaty about dolphin and only those 16 countries have dolphin in their waters, for instance. This is just an example. So we have to become more sophisticated in this concept of multilateralism. But I don't have an answer, I only have questions, and I think we need to explore that to respond to the issue of GSI, which again, to me, is only a step. And it could become better, and we have to stop looking at trade as something static. It is essentially dynamic in movement, and now the WTO sort of system has to adapt to this dynamic evolution, including through GSI.
Thank you both.
My personal view.
I might end the formal session of proceedings there. I think we ended on two questions that really perfectly encapsulate the questions and the scale of the challenge. Where is multilateralism going? And just this very real perception that exists in the public, and it came out in a couple of questions, that the WTO is a problem for these trade and issues. The fact that, as you said, even the US trade representative doesn't necessarily buy into the notion that liberalization is a good really encapsulates the scale of the challenges that I think this book tries to address and offer constructive paths forward on. So on that note, let me thank all of our audience for their patience. Let me thank the technical team for their patience and for not rushing me like an Athenian galley of war for letting this run overtime. Let me thank again the professors for an outstanding discussion. And let me invite all of you to join us for coffee, miling around, and further discussion of these big ideas. Thank you all so much.